Well, welcome. This is Brian Stafford, and I'm going to be speaking about healing our connection to self, earth, and community as part of the 2020 Illumine Solarize event online, obviously. And it's all part of the masculine path to healing. And maybe just an overview of where we might be headed is I'm going to be talking about what Illumine does a little bit, but more about what the Animas Valley Institute offers and how Animas and Illumine have been kind of weaving together partnerships for, 10 years or so. And to talk about what Illumine does and what Animas offers, in some sense, beyond Illumine. In many ways, Illumine is the best preparation for what Animas offers for men. And that was my experience, and I'm going to share a lot about that too, my personal experience and how it might be relevant for men in Illumine, especially at this time when we are facing questions of healing and patriarchy and disparity and climate change and absolute cultural disruption, no matter what culture you're in. Now, there might also be time for a deep imaginal journey. We'll see how the time goes here. So I'm going to be watching the time and ending in 55 minutes. But I wanted to thank you for logging on for this talk. And I want to start with a poem by one who's gone beyond and one that might resonate for some of you about where you are in your life. It's Mary Oliver's The Journey. So I just invite you to close your eyes and to feel what's happening in the world right now and feel what's happening personally in your life in terms of your relationships and your identity and your career and the planet. And then I'll just begin speaking her words. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough in a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world. Determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. Well, the state of the world, let's use our framework of self, earth, and community. I'd say it's fairly fragmented. Most individuals feel fairly fragmented right now and disconnected, and certainly our leadership, or whatever you want to call that, feels that way. The rates of mental health problems have never been higher. The rates of suicidality, completed suicide, have in some ways never been higher. This time for certain age groups, and mental health issues are showing up in younger and younger people and in greater severity. And now we have lack of access to support. And then there's this growing awareness about, well, everything has changed by the pandemic. And will there be, at least in the United States, an ongoing democratic process? All of these can be incredibly fragmenting. Meanwhile, the earth is filled with a fair amount of ecological disasters. Here in California, where I live, there's been lots of fires, as you know, and the entire West is burning. And we read more and more about climate change and increasing carbon dioxide and raising the pH of the sea and the warming of the waters as well. Not much good news. And then in community, well, fortunately we have Illumine and we have Solarize. These communities that help men support them wherever they're at and meet them and support their authenticity, but there's still a fair amount of patriarchy in the world, and we can feel that in the debates. There's a fair amount of white supremacy in the world. which has wreaked lots of problems for the entire planet, as well as most of the species and those that maybe are darker color or feminine or indigenous. So the state of the world is not good, and we might have a time to share a little bit about how Animas's perspective is on why that might be the case. Just to jump back briefly into Illumin and MROP, which is how I found Illumin. Illumin is really interested in becoming and supporting men become more authentic men, and they're entirely open to letting men from any background enter into their work. They describe their offerings as inner work with authentic relationships without judgment, ritual experience to make a shift from maybe the ego into something sacred. Animas Valley Institute's a little bit different than that. Animas Valley Institute kind of wants to make things not so safe, actually. Welcoming, but not safe for the ego. Animas's mission, and Animas Valley Institute has been around for about 40 years, developed by Bill Plotkin, and now has about, 16 to 20 guides and about 100 trainees, and runs programs around the world, and also has partnership programs, including with Illumin. Animas is really interested in cultural transformation by fostering a nature-based personal development. And the way Animas works is they guide individuals in a sense of leaving their identity behind and discovering what's waiting for them in the mysteries of nature and psyche. It's our belief at Animas and our experience and our understanding, and each of the guides and most of the individuals who've gone on our programs understanding that to become a true adult means to discover the mythopoetic core of one's life and the calling at that place that doesn't come from the ego. You can't really figure it out or think your way into it. It's a bit of a surrender and a discovery at a time in deep liminal space. And one thing that's different, which we might have time to talk about, is that an authentic adult, we might have very different definitions between Illumin and Animas Valley Institute based on our work. Just wanted to give you a little history of the interweaving between Illumin and Animas before diving into my story and then further. Animas was founded in the late 70s, early 80s, and Bill kind of evolved the practice of what he was doing with soulcraft with many different guides and different formats. And then he wrote the book Soulcraft in the 2000s, and Richard read it. And then I think Richard and Bill had a chat and then invited Bill to consider supporting males in the men's rite of passage, and then had Bill in conversation with some of the leaders. And then in 2012, in February, Bill and Richard did a combined event. Unfortunately, Richard was ill, called Nature and Human Soul. And this was held in New Mexico, and there were 1,000 individuals. This is primarily through the Center for Action and Contemplation it was held, but there were many men from Illumin, and I was in attendance there. And one thing we noticed at Animas, as I joined Animas soon thereafter, is that many men who had attended this conference or had done men's rite of passage work with Illumin came over and started doing Animas programs. Eventually this evolved actually to my starting with Bill, something called the Wild Mind Training Program at Animas, and many of our first trainees were actually men who were deep in Illumin. And then a couple years ago, you might recall, the Illumin leadership invited Bill to speak at Solarize, and those videos are still available on the YouTube channel. And then as we moved deeper into kind of conversation about partnership, I gave a bit of a program for the Illumin leadership in Missouri in 2019. And then we ran our first partnership program this past fall online, because all of our work has gone online, probably like most of yours. So that's a little bit of history from the interweaving of the two. And Animas offers counsel. We don't necessarily offer elder rights, but we do offer opportunities for people to discover their nature-based leadership and community. So in some ways we're similar to Illumin, but in many ways we're also very different in terms of what we're actually guiding men toward. I wanted to share a little bit about my experience because my experience with Illumin and Animas are totally interwoven, and I'm very grateful to Illumin and very grateful to Richard. So about 10 years ago, I was in the middle of my life and things were going okay on the career side. Like I was wildly successful, more than I could ever imagined actually, and kind of got to the top of my profession a little bit too early. And something was missing. There was a sense of achievement, completed. What else can be accomplished after what I've achieved? And then my marriage wasn't in a really good place, and there was a lack of vitality and my sense of wanting to continue doing my work, and certainly a loss of enchantment and a disconnection from the feminine part of myself and the erotic part of myself. And there was a deep longing to kind of walk away from a lot of it and just go west, go over. I lived in Denver at the time, go over the Continental Divide and live there, more wildlife, something like that would be the best way I could articulate it then. And then one night I woke up in the middle of the night and a voice said, "You're done." I thought, oh shit, I have no idea what that means, except that things are going to change and I may have to walk away from everything. I asked one of my friends and shared a little bit about what was going on. He shared one of Richard's books with me. I can't remember exactly which one it was because I read 2 or 3. And then I signed up for a men's rite of passage in Central Texas in the hill country, I guess, and had a pretty powerful experience. It was the first time I experienced a council, first time I was around a group of men, and in this kind of format where I wasn't the leader. And I really had a powerful experience on the solo, even though it was 6 hours. You know, it seemed like a long time just to kind of be quiet, but a lot happened in that circle, and I was pretty curious about it. It was just the right time for that for me to happen. And then at the end of that program, I remember receiving a piece of paper like the firming sheet, how to go deeper in the masculine spiritual journey. About halfway down the page, there was a listing of this book, Soulcraft, Crossing into the Mysteries of Nature and Psyche by Bill Plotkin. And I saw it and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I've been talking for a long time and curious about if there is a soul. I was deep in spiritual work all of my life. I was raised very strongly evangelical, kind of walked away from that as I moved into medicine and my training as a psychiatrist, and had some experiences of dark nights of the soul about wondering, was there anything else besides matter? And the question of soul had always been there. And when I saw this title, it just kind of latched into me. So right there in the San Antonio airport, I downloaded Bill's book, Soulcraft, and started reading it. I'd say about page 10, I kind of knew that my life as a physician was probably going to come to end. The feeling I remember now was, if the world is the way that Bill writes about, that's the world I want to live in. It was much more enchanting, deeply connected to nature, abounding with mystery and synchrony. And there was just something that deeply touched my soul. Actually, I was on a sabbatical at the time because I wasn't sure if I wanted to remain in medicine. But I had about 2 or 3 weeks left, and I went right to the Animas website and signed up for a program. And that program also continued to foster me out of my first adulthood, my first adolescence, in the first life of the ego, and on a path toward a deeper understanding of who I am and what I'm here to do. That program was called the Soulcraft Journey. And it was held in southeastern Utah. And the first night, it was very cold, probably about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And there was, I think, 9 or 10 other participants. And we spent the first night kind of camped out on the rim of a Red Rock Canyon. And it was the first time I'd experienced a council the way Animas had seated. And we were seated around a fire, and I was sitting in my chair, which is one of those blow up chairs. And during the fire, right before we started, a spark flew and landed right on my inflatable chair and burned a hole in it and deflated it. Well, that was synchronous and filled with meaning. And then the talking piece was passed to me, and it was a kind of a beautiful stone egg, and I held it and waited for what wanted to come, and I surprised myself with what came out of me. We were about a month past Easter, and I have 2 boys, and in our family, we'd eat the whites of the egg, but we wouldn't eat the yolk. Just didn't taste right that way. And as I held this egg, I said something like, in my family, we don't like the yolk. We don't like the gold. We live our lives as if they're hard boiled and we can't feel the life that wants to live and spring and fly from within the egg. Something like that. It was really powerful. And I was surprised that I had said something that was a bit critical of who I was and a bit critical of my life. And then that night on the rim of the canyon, it was started to rain. Again, it was about 35 degrees now and didn't sleep very well, but I did have a dream. And in the dream, I'm in like a lecture hall or a student hall. And I'm seated there with, I don't know, 20 to 30 other students. And it's kind of like a spelling bee where the teacher in the front is asking the students questions, and whoever answers correctly gets to stay in the game. And whoever answers incorrectly kind of drops out. And my understanding of myself, I was always the guy that people looked to for the answers. So it was in the stream. The teacher kept eventually just kind of asking me the questions as others fell away. And then the teacher looked at me and asked me this question and said it this way: now for the most important question of your life, we get syzygy. And in the dream, I just remember anticipation to get the most important question of my life right, and to succeed and to be a great success, and then to not understand at all what was being asked of me. And kind of like on spelling bees, I asked, what language is this? Can you repeat it again? Is there a different pronunciation? And each time the teacher, who was a woman at the front, said this, we get syzygy. And I woke up in a panic. And I knew in that moment, I didn't know the language of my soul. That's all I knew. It was a deep intuition. I might have all the answers as a psychiatrist, as a man, as a father. I really didn't have all those answers, but I think I felt like that, but I didn't know the language of my soul. And that was the most important question of my life. Well, that opened me up in a big way for further experiences through what they call an Animas soulcraft practices. It was an 8-day program in this beautiful canyon in southeastern Utah, where there was a creek that ran through and just beautiful trees. There were cottonwoods and lots of other coniferous trees as well, and lizards and snakes and frogs, and even a kiva down there from the original peoples of that area. And about, I don't know, 2/3 through the way through the program, we were invited to go for a 24-hour solo with some questions. And one of the questions I had come up at Illumin about my relationship with masculine elders, actually. I had one grandfather who had 15 children and about 33 grandchildren, of which I was one, and didn't have a close relationship because how could you? We lived a long way away. And I had another grandfather who really didn't like children, actually. So I had not much of a relationship with him either. So I felt like I was missing something, like a relationship with a masculine elder who just loved me for who I was and didn't want me to be something, right? You know that parents kind of require you to be something. And grandparents kind of say, just let him be who he is. That kind of absolute love. That was one of the things I was longing for. And when I went out for my wander, what I found was a juniper tree. And it was not just juniper tree, it was a grandfather juniper tree. And I asked if I could be held in his arms, and I climbed up onto his lap, this massive juniper tree in this desert canyon. And he held me throughout the day. And I told him stories about my life and told him stories of how my life would have been different had I had a grandfather who really wanted to hold me and to heal me and to provide that relationship of only what a grandfather can. I didn't really get hungry during that time, just kind of enjoyed my time being in the quiet, away from my work and my family. And I slept under the tree that night, and in the middle of the night, I'm not really sure exactly what was happening, but I thought it was a dream, but I was pretty sure I was awake. And in the middle of the night, this indigenous woman of the canyon came to me. And I was kind of watching her and not really sure exactly what was happening because my consciousness was a bit altered. She said, "Welcome home, welcome home." And I burst into tears. Realized I was coming home to a different part of myself, a different connection with who I am, maybe a different connection with Earth. I really experienced her as kind of an Earth mother. And that was pretty altering. Yeah, a couple days later, we hiked out of the canyon and I drove back to Denver where I was working and really feeling, wow, what's happened to me here? What's next? I noticed myself being much more emotional, more worried about the planet and about climate change. The other thing I forgot to share about that, on the last night of that program, I had a dream. And the dream was of one adolescent dismembering another adolescent in a version of like a Law and Order episode with knives. And a couple days later, I got an email from Animas, and one of the headlines was, "Anyone up for more dismemberment?" And I was like, whoa, that's kind of synchronous. I am. And it was for what Animas calls the Animas fast, or the soul fast, or a vision fast. So I signed up for that, and that happened, I don't know, maybe 6 months after that. And that was the most powerful experience of my life, these 12 days actually in southwestern Utah, in a beautiful wilderness area, desert, where I enacted my own death, prayed that I discovered who I really was, my own deep identity, as David White says, the truth at the center of the image I was born with, and to heal my relationship with Earth, the poet of myself, for my elder sister who had died at birth, and all the women that had wounded me or I had wounded. I had 4 days in the desert to do that on a solo. It was transformative, and I was ready, and I did hear my name, and I had a dream of who I was on the deepest identity. I probably won't share that today, but you might hear about it if you ever join me on a program, either in Illumin or at Animas. Several months later, I attended that program where Richard and Bill were together, called the Nature and the Human Soul Intensive at Tamaya. And then I left medicine 3 months after that, and it was very clear that I no longer fit in psychiatry. I didn't really want to be there anymore. I understood the world very differently. It wasn't about helping people adapt and survive an unhealthy culture. It was about discovering their deepest identity and transforming the culture so that all could be healed and whole. So I left my position as a professor, entered the training program at Animas, began guiding with Animas 2 years later, and then I started something called the Wild Mind Training Program based on Bill's latest book at the time. And then what I noticed, there were a lot of Animas trainees who had come from Illumin into our training program, and I began guiding Illumin men with them in different locations around the country, in Colorado and Arizona and California. And then again, Bill had the talk at Solarize, and then we entered into a formal partnership of which I've been kind of spearheading as Director of Strategic Initiatives at Animas. And really feel called to offer this work. We offer our work with almost entire scholarship to men from Illumin. So I wanted to share a little bit about that story so you kind of get a sense of what I'm speaking about, of some of the experiences that can happen when one goes down into Soul Canyon, as Animas would call it, which is different than being in a council or in a men's group. It's a discovery of what's in one's deeper nature and what one discovers when they're longing and are ready for a soul encounter. So I'm actually going to share my screen now here. See if I can do this, and then go through a couple slides. All right, so here's a map. This is a map that we don't use very often at Animas. This is a map, what we called egocentric stages of development. And this is what has led Western culture to kind of be trapped in patriarchy, white supremacy, and leading to ecological disaster. I'll show you another map or wheel of development we use, but this is a way of how to create an unhealthy culture and what happens. In an unhealthy culture, infants and toddlers are told no quite a bit and encouraged to conform. And it's all about being obedient or receiving rewards for things. And then they become young children, kind of elementary to prepubescent. It's all about how can we get them the skills so that they can have a good job in an unhealthy culture, which leads in adolescence to having a couple of options. One is you can conform to that, or you can rebel against it. The majority of Western culture, especially for the past, say, 80 years, has been in an educational, religious, and cultural system of conformity to the culture as it is, which is a very unhealthy culture because it's a white techno-industrial growth culture rather than a nature-based culture, which helps individuals, children, adolescents, adults discover their true nature and to live from that place. And another unhealthy stage here is secession, where adolescents give up on their authenticity and their life hopes, and they get a job because that's what you do, and that's how you might find a partner, and that's what your parents want, and that's what's expected, and you have to have health insurance. And then at midlife, you might capitulate further. At 28 to 30, you might feel the longing to do something else, but not knowing others who've walked away, saying, okay, this is what life is. I have children, I have a mortgage. And then you might get promoted, which means you're even stuck further in not being your true self, but being what a patho-adolescent or egocentric self, not knowing your deeper connection to the earth or to inner nature. And then you might get to retirement, where it's time for pasture and playtime, right? Sometimes at this point is where individuals switch wheels and they move toward an ecocentric wheel. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. But first I might have to stop share. Let me see here. There we go. So this way of understanding the world is the way that our culture is business as usual. It's really designed for people to fit into positions in organizations and industrial growth culture. It's not the way we were meant to be. So what Animas does is it takes a step out of that. And you can read this here, obviously can pause it and take a look at it. We help people move away from who they think they are and discover who they really are. And we guide something called the journey of soul initiation. And part of it is it really shifts consciousness. As you heard, speaking in council can shift consciousness. Camping in the wilds with wind and rain can shift consciousness. You're away from your computers and your cell phone. That shifts consciousness. The dreams shift consciousness. Imaginal journeys shift consciousness. Having a solo fasting for 24 hours shifts consciousness, and it shifts how you both perceive and participate in the world. Now, the work at Animas is not to help you fit in or to improve your personal problems. It's really about discovering who you really are. Okay. And some of the particular things we do is we facilitate a process called eco-awakening, which is kind of what happened to me in a certain sense when Grandmother Earth welcomed me home. We also facilitate wholeness and self-healing, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. We also help complete tasks of development so that men can move from adolescence psychospiritually to a second adolescence psychospiritually, and then to becoming true adults and elders. And primarily, we guide the journey of soul initiation. Here's one of the maps that we use here, and this is from Bill's latest book, which will be out in December. So I encourage you to pre-order it, Secrets of the Journey of Soul Initiation. And this is an expansion of how we understand a rite of passage to work. It's actually 5 steps. It's not 3, as Van Genep had described. It's not severance, descent, and then return. It's really preparation. And each journey that we take, we might have multiple kind of little journeys like this, where we cross a liminal space and what we thought we were falls away. We discover something more authentic and then return, beginning to live that way. So it is true also with the journey of soul initiation that we spend most of our lives preparing to be ready to discover who we really are. This is what nature-based peoples knew. But because they lived in nature and in a pretty healthy culture and in conversation with mysteries and their emotions and their bodies and the earth, they're ready sooner than we are, actually. And many people in our culture are never ready because we live in such an unhealthy culture that they're living primarily in a place of woundedness, that they're not prepared to be further dismembered. So here's some of the preparatory work, and I certainly experienced quite a bit of this in my time on the Illumined Men's Rite of Passage, and went further on the other programs with Animas. Part of it is we need to cultivate our ways of knowing. So much of Western culture is about thinking, but it's not about being present and centered and in one's senses, or being embodied and connected to one's emotions, or to feel one's sensual and erotic nature and to know how to court things and be in a romance with the earth or the feminine or the mysteries. And there's also what's really suppressed in our culture is the imaginal, right? So many children here, it's just your imagination. What it might be that imagination is what makes us very unique as a species. And we know that in the Bible, most encounters with the sacred occurred in nature or in the dream time, but that's not the case in Western culture, typically. And we need to also activate not just thinking in terms of short term, but deep time thinking, heart-centered thinking about 7 generations forward, something like that. So that's one way that Animas cultivates that. And we activate these archetypes, which I'll talk about in a second here. We also learn how the parts of ourself that we maybe have over-identified with and think who we are actually hold us back. This is part of the healing or the self-healing process, right? The work at Animas also discovers that the parts that hold you back also might have a gift for you. We call that cultivating of the fourfold self and moving into our deeper identity. How does Animas do this? It's a bit different than Illumin, although we do hold councils and we do have programs in nature. It's primarily about your conversation with nature by wandering, by discovering deep imaginal guides, dream work, and I'll list a bunch of soulcraft practices here in just a bit. And part of this wholeness is to really live from that new place in preparation for what comes next. Okay. Here's one of the maps we use. You might have seen this if you went to Solarize in 2018, right? This is the intrapersonal view of the map of the human psyche. It's actually a horizontal map with spirit being above and soul being below. And the inner circle are what we call our protector parts, or fragmented parts, which is maybe a little bit pejorative, but really the protector parts that most of us know. We have critics that interfere with our deep longings and say, who are you to pursue that? What you have is good enough. Or skeptics or flatters that say, if you leave this, it's going to go to shit. You better not leave. All of these tend to keep us small. And then we also have these wounded children, and I'll go talk about them a little bit later, and the escapists and addicts. Those are all the ways that we had to develop in our ego structures to survive our childhood. Early on, these structures began forming, probably before age 5, in order to keep us safe about what was really allowed in our family, our Sunday schools, our educational system, our neighborhoods. When who we really are, and maybe this is what Richard calls the true self, is our wholeness here, that we have these other archetypes here, the innocent sage, sacred fool, trickster, right, who's wily and gets the big picture and playful and okay with paradox, and the wild indigenous one who's totally connected to body and earth, knows primarily through emotions in the body. And those other archetypes of the West here, a bit more cryptic, the dark muse beloved, a guide to soul, and the nurturing generative adult. It's really these South and these West facets that are dangerous to Western culture, and also really dangerous to the historical masculine. Really dangerous. And this is one way we need to be healed. One way that we get stuck in white patriarchy is we don't deal with our shadow, right, which is usually projected and called dark. And we don't have a relationship with our feminine, which leads to patriarchy. This is how others might view us when we're in these archetypes. So when we're in our wholeness in the north, we might be seen as an activist, teacher, mentor, benevolent king, a little different than the other ones that Illumin uses. In the east, we're also seen in these innocent sage, trickster, fool. And in the south, we're the green man, we're Pan, we're the wild man. And in the west, we might be seen as a wanderer or soul guide, something like that. Now, remember a couple of slides ago, I talked about the egocentric wheel. It's our understanding, and also been verified by a couple of indigenous elders, that it might be that people in Western culture, and maybe everyone, has a deeper structure of how to live a soul-centric life, where we come in from spirit at birth here, and you can see the little one there, with a gift of presence and innocence and wonder in middle childhood, and then we move to early adolescence filled with fire. One of the things that's a little bit missing here, and I'll show in the next one, is our connection to earth, and when we cross over from living an egocentric childhood or adolescence to an ecocentric childhood or adolescence. Then the place that very few people in Western culture get to, but Animas specializes in, is this late adolescence. What we call the wanderer in the cocoon, wandering in the mysteries of nature and psyche, the one who's left their first house of belonging and has been called out to discover who they are. And then moving into another stage, usually months or years later, of after they discover their mythopoetic identity and some of their powers and who they're called to bring it to, is fashioning like a first delivery system and apprenticing with those who already are doing that in the world and discovering how we do it. And then eventually moving into late adulthood, where we're offering seeds of cultural renaissance, something unique that comes solely from our own unique way of giving to the world. We're not doing it the way others do it. We're doing our own unique way, and it comes from the depths of our conversation. And then moving on to elderhood. All of this is described in Bill's book, Nature and the Human Soul. I encourage you to take a look at that one. It's a pretty long book. We also have intensives in that. And this is where Bill and Richard, the intensive they gave 8 years ago, and we also offer these programs for Illumin men through Animas. Here's another version of it here, and I only show it here because if you go around to stage 3, if you could overlap that egocentric wheel onto the ecocentric wheel, some people begin to wake up and enter into a healthy adolescence, what we call the thespian of the oasis, which is really about, how do I live authentically in the world? How does that occur? It's not about conforming or getting ahead or safety or security or status. It's about, how do I participate in Earth, where I understand Gaia, not cognitively, but psychospiritually, and I act on behalf of the Earth and maybe my own watershed. This is a process that happens to many men. It's called eco-awakening, and it's kind of an artifact of Western culture. But very often, and I would imagine this could happen on a men's rite of passage, or it frequently happens on our programs at Animas or a Quest, where an individual has an experience that they primarily belong to the Earth community. It's not about being a doctor or a dentist or an insurance executive or a father or a Christian or a Buddhist. It's something else, that I primarily belong to Earth. Everything else has become secondary. This is what nature-based peoples always know, and this is what they're talking about and what they're writing about and what we've forgotten. Right? This is an important developmental step, and it's a step that I think the more that Illumin moves towards some nature-based work, the more you're going to be seeing this happen for your men. Some of the other things we offer at Animas are maps and models and a bit of description of how do we become healthy adolescents, adults, and elders. Part of it is focusing on tasks of the stages here. And this is something that I was really surprised at as a pediatrician and a child psychiatrist. I never really thought that there were developmental tasks related to nature. It was always about the ego in psychology and psychiatry. And you can see here, these 4 realms of nature tasks in early childhood are about different aspects of nature. The earth, wild nature, the human body, including our senses, the imagination, again, which is in the west part of that other map, and our emotions. as well as learning cultural ways, right? So these are tasks of education and family and church and other religious communities for kids 4 to 12. The tasks of stages for first adolescence is this, what I mentioned before, creating this authentic identity, pursuing one's passion, going full bore into it, succeeding and failing, and then molting, as we would say, finding another thing that's, oh, that used to be the thing, but now it's something else, right? And this is certainly where I see Illumin offering a lot of these opportunities in the different types of groups in the men's rite of passage. It really offers these opportunities to move toward with how do we deal with conflict? How do we open up to the father wound and to feel our longing for the feminine? How do we speak truthfully and authentically in a council? Something like that. But most of our Western culture would say this is what a healthy adult is. In the Animas understanding, this is what a healthy adolescent is achieving. And it moves you to your second adolescence, which is the second adolescence, where it's really not about belonging, or it's about achievement or status or security or even ego authenticity. It's something different. It's like the psycho-spiritual center of gravity has shifted from that to that's over. I'm a bit lost. What am I really here to do? What is love? What is God? What is mystery? Who am I really? And it can be a bit traumatic, and it can be filled with both grief because you feel like you kind of mastered something and then you're called further, kind of like what I shared in my own story. Like I finally got to the top of my profession with safety and security and status and achievement and opportunity to do all kinds of wonderful things for the families I worked with. And then mystery said, no, that's not really it. You've done that part of your development. It's time to go further. And the two major tasks here are leaving home, which is to step away from who you think you are. So it's not about speaking authentically. It's about walking away from who you think you are. Part of that is releasing attachment to your personality. And that's really hard, especially for men where we primarily identify with the career. Really hard, right? Also means, what other things did I leave behind to be a success? Or even if I'm not a success by other standards, what have I left behind, and what are the other tasks of development I might need to focus on? What addictions do I need to step away from or get help with? What about the way I've been wounded that I could say, my life would be really great if this thing didn't happen or keep happening over and over in a certain way? That's some of the work we do at Animas. It also means you choose authenticity over being accepted by others. That's a tricky one in our culture, right? It's also about apprenticing with death. And we're certainly doing that as a culture right now, both for our institutions, ecologically as well. And the pandemic has made it, wow, our life is totally different. So everything is disrupted. And this is a great opportunity to contemplate, what if I were to die in the next couple days? What is left unlived? How do I feel about that? Right? So that's the first task of this stage, is walking away from who we are, maybe in a celebration and stating it's finished, maybe through enacting a vision fast, something like that. The other part of this is really where Animas is unique in what they offer, is they really have these great tool bag of different soulcraft practices that help you explore the mysteries of nature and psyche, dream work and counsel, ceremony, deep imagery, nature dialogues, trance drumming and dancing. I think you guys remember, some of you, the trance dance, which has now been adapted for Illumin and Solar Eyes. All of these different things here help us explore the mysteries of nature and our own psyche and the psyche of Earth in a different way. Some of the other things listed here also help us cultivate a relationship, a soulful relationship to life, being alone, right? Wandering in nature, living the questions of soul, discovering what's in our shadow, right? Volunteering and going exactly where our inner critic tells us not to go. Some of those things and the others listed here. These all help facilitate a further dismemberment, dissolution, as in the map, of who we think we are and what we're here to do, until we kind of get to a place where that old life is really dead and we don't really know who we are. We're kind of without an identity. We're deeply in the liminal. We're not just in the limin, we're just deep. We don't know who we are. We're betwixt and between identities, right? Down here in this place, at the bottom of Soul Canyon, where we might encounter our soul. So I talked a little bit about preparation. This is just for your benefit to take a look at here. Severance also mentioned this both in my personal one as well as some of the practices we do to wander away from our deep identity. When we're dissolving, we're not trying to figure anything out. Our goal is to actually fall apart. And that's what Animas does fiercely and compassionately. And then we offer these different soulcraft practices so that we can discover who we are, either through a memory or a dream, or in some other altered state of consciousness. We hear our name, or we see our identity, or we just remember who we are, or something like that. A lot of different ways that occurs. And here's one of the goals of this stage of development, and one of life, is to discover who we are on the soul level. And this is described in Bill's book, Soulcraft, as well as his upcoming book. There comes a point where you've completed the task of development, where you've wandered away from your first identity, ego, your ego identity, a healthy ego identity, and you've severed and you're down in Soul Canyon here. And you might get a glimpse of who you are. In his book, he shares the story of how he discovered he was cocoon weaver. And it happened when he was in a meadow on a fast, and this butterfly came up, brushed his cheek, and he heard the name. And was a bit altered by that, didn't really know what to do with that encounter for a while, and then began to wonder more about it and to begin to imagine and to live into it. That's the way it is for all of us. I had my soul encounter on that vision fast where I had a dream. And in the dream, I remember who I am. And this image tells me who I am and where he's come from and what he's here to do. Incredibly powerful. And it was really the end of my first life. That I'm not necessarily here to be a doctor helping people to function in a dysfunctional culture. I'm primarily here to heal the culture and to create and to take out the dams wherever wildness and soul are blocked, both physically and metaphorically and psychospiritually, right? After that, on your way to becoming an initiated adult, you keep falling apart from who you think you were, right? And this is going to be more described in Bill's latest book, and I don't want to share too much on it, but that's another stage, until you begin living it into the world. Bill began living Cocoon Weaver, first as a vision fast guide, and then other programs, then as a writer and an agent of cultural transformation in so many different ways. He guides people into a death and a dismemberment of who they thought they were, just as the caterpillar dies in a cocoon or chrysalis, becomes caterpillar soup, and then later gets rearranged and begins living itself as the imago butterfly into the world. This, in some sense, is the reason we were all born, was to enact our soul identity into the world. This is what nature-based peoples historically known, and what terrified, perhaps, missionaries, that they would go out into the wild in the dark and have conversations that they had lost and their peoples had lost, and their belief, after being disconnected from the erotic and the imaginal and the indigenous and earth, that what they were doing was perhaps satanic rather than healthy. We're all called to this journey. We're all called to live our unique gift back into the world. It's not an easy journey. It requires resourcing. And it also requires community. And historically, that hasn't been something Animas has had. One of the wonderful things about the pandemic, if there is one, is that there is more of a community in the Animas online space. But also what's unique about Illumin is you guys already have an established community. And you can send people out on our programs. And if you've gone before, you can welcome people back knowing of what's happened and what gift they hold. As you would say, what gold do you come back with, right? I think I'll skip over that. Well, I'll just say, this is what a lot of I see as an outsider of what Illumin and the Men's Rite of Passage does. It offers community. It also helps individuals cultivate some of these early childhood and adolescent tasks. It creates soulful containers invites people into ritual, and it really prepares them for leaving or getting to the edge of Soul Canyon. Again, as I mentioned in my own story and in some of the other slides, it's also about holding and self-healing. It allows men to discover their wounds and to weep and to feel their emotions openly amongst other men. It encourages them to be fully present in conversation with the natural world. I hear that more and more, and I know that Dr. Glenn Siegel will be also offering a talk on this. I encourage you to check out his story. And I know that other trainees, including Glenn and Mark Timken, have offered a dream program recently. And the other thing that Illumin does is it really encourages that this is a lifelong journey. And maybe that's one of the challenges of the word initiate. Initiate can mean many things. I'm an initiated man primarily means, to me, initiated into an organization or a completion of a program. And the way we use it at Animas is you're initiated into your soul identity. And those are very different things. All right, so our partnership will be continuing. And you'll see more about that in the newsletter sent out by Brad. We did have a program in September with 7 Illumin men, which dropped to 6 because one had to go back to work early on. And it was a very powerful experience, even though it was in an online format. We had men from across the United States as well as from Scotland. And they all had very profound experiences. And one of the other unique things was it was all men, obviously, but we also had this unique Illumin core and language of a place that we were starting from, which I think just deepened the program. And it led to wanting to continue in relationship further post-program. We'll be starting a dream group shortly just with those men, and also what we call electronic talking staff council. I don't think we have time for what I wanted to do here, which was an imaginal guide, but I will actually drum one up and send it to Brad. Maybe he can make it available also when he shares this talk, this Zoom talk in the YouTube channel, and maybe you can also add an audio file to it. You might want to check that out. And I'm certainly open to questions sometime, but I'd really primarily encourage you to continue moving more deeply into your Illumin journey and to feel what's your edge. Are you at the edge of Soul Canyon? Is it primarily a time for discovering what Earth is? Do you want to be welcomed home by the Earth Mother? Or is it time that you walk away and are somewhat dismembered so that you're no longer who you thought you were? What time is it for you? So I invite you to ponder about that, maybe go for a wander after you hear this talk, and to cross the threshold asking the deepest questions. Like, what comes to me? Why am I here? Is it time for a fast? Is it time to cross a threshold and wander into the mysteries of nature and psyche? What are the deepest questions I hold right now? Who am I really? Why was I born in this time? Those kinds of questions. And you might come across a being that feels like it's entirely doing what it was born to do. Right? It might be a tree or a plant, or I don't know, even a sculpture or something. It's likely born rather than human crafted. But you might wonder, and if there's a being out there that just strikes you as, wow, it's just doing what it's actually supposed to be doing, you might hang out with it for a while, using all your senses, being fully present to it for many minutes, looking at it, see how it's totally itself and totally serves its little ecosystem. You might feel what it feels like for it to be doing that, totally authentic, doing what it was born to do. See what memories come for you, other symbols or images, how it makes you feel to be in the presence of this one. Then you might tell it out loud what you notice about it. Here's what I notice about you, being who is wildly authentic and serving itself and others. And go on as long as you can. And then when you're finished, you might speak out loud about what you know about what you're doing in the world and how it's inauthentic or inauthentic. Like, it could be an inauthentic success in the world. That's hard to walk away from. Right? You might be an authentic success, but it might be over. It might be time to go deeper. to go beneath the surface, to go down into Soul Canyon. Yeah, just speaking truthfully, whatever it is you know about where you are in your life, and to tell the being, and this is what I know, and to maybe see what comes out of your mouth. Maybe it'll also be something surprising, like it was when I was on the top of that canyon holding that council egg. I'd like to close again with Mary Oliver's The Journey, and just invite you to maybe listen to the words again, maybe close your eyes, imagine yourself maybe at the edge of a canyon near where you are, or the edge of a cliff over the ocean, somewhere where there's a descent ahead and a drop, and if you go down, you'll be wonderfully and irrevocably changed. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried. But you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do. Though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible, it was already late enough, in a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. And with that, I'd like to conclude knowing that it's my belief that if we continue to move toward Earth and nature, and to court her, and to wonder what is our relationship and where do we belong in Earth and in the scheme of the mysteries in the cosmos, we might discover a newfound wholeness. We might find an ability to self-heal some of our wounded parts. We might discover our unique way of belonging to Earth, and we might return from that canyon offering ourselves as a gift to our people, and by that way, stepping away from a system that no longer serves. Right? The same system that Jesus stepped away from. Are you going to be a servant king, or are you going to be a tyrant king? It's my understanding that it's this journey of soul initiation by which we're healed, and that we might understand and begin to help correct and heal the earth and the earth's beings from the destruction that our humanity and our species has caused for the earth. And it might change irrevocably our understanding of the feminine, of darkness, thereby healing patriarchy and racism. So thank you for attending today. If you have any curiosities about this, stay tuned. We'll be sending links through the Illumin website soon for future partnership programs, just for Illumin men. And it was an honor to be here today, and I'm very grateful to Illumin and the Illumin leadership for inviting me to share a little bit more of our partnership. And I hope it didn't sound too proselytizing or too promotional, but I have to tell you, Illumin and Animas saved my life and helped me heal myself. And now I know how to serve so that others might find their own healing and way of service. So thank you very much.